Before there were hospitals, before there were doctors in the American South, there was a woman. She came in the middle of the night, through rain, through cold, through fields she did not own, on land that would never belong to her. She carried no bag of medicine. She carried knowledge, ancient, powerful, unbreakable knowledge, passed down through generations of African women who understood the human body before the word medicine existed in the English language. She was a midwife. She was enslaved, and she knew every secret the plantation would ever try to hide. To understand the power of the black slave midwife, you have to first understand how completely she was necessary. In the antebellum American South, the period between the late 1700s and the Civil War in 1865, trained medical doctors were a luxury that most white plantation families could barely afford, and black enslaved people were almost never given access to at all. Into that vacuum stepped the midwife. And in the South, the midwife was almost always a black enslaved woman. These women did not simply assist in childbirth. They were the entire medical system for hundreds of thousands of people across multiple generations. They diagnosed, they treated, they healed, they delivered. They buried the ones they could not save. Historian Charla Fett, in her groundbreaking work on the medicine of enslaved people, documents how midwives operated across entire plantation communities as the primary healthcare providers, not just for black families, but for white ones too. A white plantation mistress having her 5th child. She called for the black midwife, an enslaved woman in the quarters suffering a difficult labor at midnight. The same woman crossed that same field to help her. She moved between two worlds that everyone else kept rigidly separated. And in that movement she saw everything. Think about what that means for a moment. Every birth on a plantation, black or white, passed through her hands. Every secret that a birth could reveal, she witnessed first. The baby, born too light-skinned, to belong to the man whose name it would carry. The baby born with features that matched no one in the white family's bloodline. The baby born in silence, quietly handed away before the master came home. She saw it all, and she kept her mouth shut, because her life depended on it, because the lives of her children depended on it, because sometimes silence was the only form of power that a woman in chains was allowed to hold. Here is something that American history books have almost entirely erased. The medical knowledge that black slave midwives carried into the American South did not come from nowhere. It came from Africa. The women who were kidnapped from West and Central Africa and forced onto slave ships brought with them a centuries-old tradition of women's medicine, obstetric care, and herbal healing that was, in many documented cases, more advanced than anything European settlers had access to at the time. In the Yoruba tradition of what is now Nigeria, female healers, known as Iyaloguns, had developed sophisticated understandings of pregnancy, labor, and postnatal care. In the Akan tradition of Ghana, women practiced a form of maternal medicine that included dietary management during pregnancy, the use of specific herbs to manage pain and bleeding, and techniques for repositioning an unborn child before a difficult birth. These were not superstitions. These were systems of knowledge, built over centuries, tested on millions of women, refined through generations of practice. And when those women were torn from their homeland and brought to America in chains, they brought that knowledge with them, hidden inside their minds, impossible to confiscate, impossible to sell, impossible to destroy. Dr. Stephanie Camp, the late historian of enslaved women's lives, wrote of how enslaved women maintained a hidden geography, a secret inner world, of knowledge, culture, and practice that existed entirely beneath the surface of what white slave owners could see or control. The midwife's knowledge was part of that hidden geography, and it made her, in ways that the plantation system could never fully acknowledge, indispensable. Planters kept records, cold, brutal records, of births and deaths on their plantations. And embedded in those records, if you know how to read them, is the evidence of how much they relied on enslaved midwives. A Georgia plantation record from 1842 lists a woman named Nellie as the attending midwife at 11 births in a single year, 6 enslaved children and 5 white children, including the plantation owner's youngest daughter. 11 births, 2 worlds, 1 woman. Nellie was never paid. Nellie was never acknowledged. Nellie was property. But Nellie held the secrets of that plantation in her hands every single time she walked into a birthing room. Let us be clear about what kind of secrets we are talking about, because this is the part of the story that American history has refused to tell plainly. The plantation was not only a place of forced labor, it was a place of systematic sexual violence. Enslaved women were raped by their enslavers, by overseers, by the enslavers' sons, by visitors, by neighbors. This was not an exception to the system, it was a feature of it. Thomas Jefferson, the man on the nickel, the man who wrote, "All men are created equal." He fathered at least 6 children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who was legally his property. For nearly 200 years, that truth was dismissed, denied, and buried. It took a DNA study in 1998 to force America to begin, only begin, to reckon with it. But Jefferson was not unique. He was normal. What happened at Monticello happened on thousands of plantations across the South, and the midwife knew. She knew when a pregnancy could not be explained by the husband. She knew when a baby arrived with features that told a different story than the one the family would put in the record. She knew which plantation mistresses carried children who were not their husbands. She knew which enslaved women had been violated by men whose names she was not permitted to speak. In some cases, the midwife was called upon to do something even darker than simply witness. Some records, carefully hidden in plantation archives, and in the testimonies collected by the Federal Writers Project during the 1930s, hint at enslaved midwives being pressured to ensure that certain births simply did not survive. A mixed-race child born to an enslaved woman whose features made his parentage obvious, inconvenient. A child born to a white woman whose father was not her husband, dangerous. The midwife stood at the edge of life and death, holding power she was never supposed to have, making decisions no human being should ever be forced to make. And then she went home, back to the quarters, back to her own children sleeping on the floor, back to her own grief, her own pain, her own secrets that she buried so deep that even her grandchildren would never know them. There is a particular kind of psychological torture that has no name in the history books, and it was lived every day by the black slave midwife. She was trusted by white families in ways that almost no other enslaved person was. She was let into bedrooms. She was given access to the most vulnerable moments of a white woman's life. She touched white babies with her bare hands before their own fathers did, and yet she was still property, still owned, still subject to being sold at any moment, separated from her own children, beaten, punished, destroyed. The intimacy was real, the power dynamic was absolute, and the contradiction of those two things existing simultaneously was something she had to carry alone every single day of her life. Harriet Washington, in her landmark book, Medical Apartheid, describes how enslaved midwives occupied a uniquely contradictory position in the Southern social order, simultaneously elevated by their indispensable skill and degraded by their legal status as property. They were respected when their hands were needed and forgotten the moment the child was safely born. But here is what the system never fully understood about these women. The trust that white families placed in them was a form of power, a quiet, unacknowledged, deeply dangerous form of power. The enslaved midwife who delivered a white woman's baby knew things about that family that could destroy them. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, she used that knowledge, not with words, not with accusations, but with silence, with careful, deliberate, strategic silence. "I know what I know" was a shield. It was protection for herself and for her community. It was leverage in a world where an enslaved black woman was supposed to have none. We find evidence of this in the WPA Slave Narratives, the collection of over 2,300 interviews with formerly enslaved people conducted in the 1930s. When interviewers asked elderly black women about their experiences as midwives, they were often met with careful, measured responses. They would speak of the children they delivered. They would speak of the herbs they used. They would speak of long nights and difficult births. But when conversations turned toward the secrets they witnessed, the women went quiet. Even 70 years later, even as free women, even with nothing left to lose, they had learned the lesson too deeply to unlearn it. Silence was survival. Silence was power. Silence was the only thing that had ever truly belonged to them. Now we come to the part of this story that reaches from the 1800s directly into the present day, because the bloodlines that black slave midwives watched being born are still alive in American families across this country, on both sides of the color line. The systematic rape of enslaved black women by white men did not just destroy individuals. It fundamentally altered the genetic and genealogical makeup of an entire nation. Studies using modern DNA analysis have repeatedly confirmed what historians and black families have known for generations. Millions of white Americans carry African ancestry they have no record of, and millions of black Americans carry European DNA that their family trees do not explain. A 2015 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, analyzing data from over 160,000 participants, found that European Americans from the American South showed measurably higher rates of African genetic ancestry than those from other regions, a direct genetic fingerprint of the Plantation era. Every one of those genetic stories began in a moment that an enslaved midwife likely witnessed. Think about what was happening in those birthing rooms. A mixed-race child born to an enslaved woman might be recorded in plantation ledgers simply as a new Negro, no father named, no ancestry recorded, no story told. But that child was someone's child, and the midwife who caught that child as it entered the world was the only witness to the truth of where it came from. Those children grew up. Some were sold, some ran, some passed as white and built families on the other side of the color line. Some stayed in the quarters and raised children and grandchildren who would one day take DNA tests and stare at the results in confused silence, trying to understand a history that was deliberately hidden from them. And on the white side of American families, a different kind of secret was being buried. White plantation mistresses were not all passive victims of their husbands' violence. History is more complicated than that. Some white women on plantations formed relationships, some coerced, some complex, some genuinely emotional, with enslaved men. These relationships were not only forbidden by law, they were punishable by death for the black man involved. When those pregnancies came to term, it was the enslaved midwife who stood in that room, who made decisions, who shaped what the story would be told as afterward. She was the first gatekeeper of American bloodlines, the first keeper of genealogical truth in a country built on genealogical lies. Here is another truth that America has tried to bury. The medical knowledge that enslaved black midwives carried was not simply used, it was stolen. As the 19th century progressed and formal medicine began to develop in the American South, white male doctors did not build their field from scratch. They built it on a foundation of knowledge they extracted from enslaved women, often through experimentation that would today be classified as torture. The most infamous example is J. Marion Sims, still honored in American medical history as the father of modern gynecology. What medical textbooks used to omit, though historians like Harriet Washington and Deirdre Cooper Owens have now made impossible to ignore, is that Sims developed His celebrated surgical techniques by performing repeated experimental surgeries on enslaved black women without anesthesia. His justification, shared by most white doctors of the era, was the racist pseudo-scientific belief that black people felt less pain than white people. This was not science. This was an ideology designed to make exploitation morally palatable. His subjects, women like Anaka, Betsy, and Lucy, whose names we now know because historians refused to let them be erased, were operated on dozens of times each, without consent, without relief, without any acknowledgement of their humanity. And their midwife contemporaries, the women who had been managing obstetric complications, treating infections, and supporting difficult deliveries for generations using knowledge that came directly from Africa. They were dismissed, pushed aside. As formal white medicine expanded, the enslaved midwife was increasingly characterized as primitive, superstitious, dangerous, even as doctors quietly adopted elements of the herbal and manual techniques she had pioneered. The word granny midwife, the term used to describe the black midwives who continued practicing in the rural South well into the 20th century, was not a term of respect. It was a dismissal, a way of marking their knowledge as folk remedy rather than real medicine, even as communities across the South depended on them for survival. Annie Lee Logan, a black midwife in Alabama, who practiced into the 1980s and whose memoir, Mother Wit, was published in 1989, described delivering over 3,000 babies over the course of her career. When formal medical licensing requirements made her practice illegal without a physician's supervision, the state of Alabama did not offer her training or integration. It simply made her skills illegal. The knowledge survived anyway, because that is what the knowledge always did. We know very few of their names. That is not an accident. The deliberate erasure of black women from the historical record of American medicine is one of the most profound acts of historical violence that this country has committed, and it is one that is only now slowly and incompletely beginning to be corrected. But the names we do have tell us everything. There was Millie, an enslaved midwife in South Carolina, whose skills were so renowned that she was hired out by her enslaver to attend births across 3 counties. Her enslaver profited from her expertise. She never saw a cent of it. There was Old Rose in Virginia, whose name appears in a plantation medical log maintained by a physician who noted her techniques with grudging admiration and then never once credited her in any formal document. There was Grandma Rachel in Mississippi, whose granddaughter, interviewed by the WPA in 1937, described her as the one who knew things the white doctors didn't know and wouldn't admit they didn't know. And there were thousands more whose names we do not have. Women who moved through the darkness of southern nights, carrying torches of knowledge that nobody thought to write down, in houses they were not permitted to own, delivering children into a world that was built on the suffering of people who looked like them. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Thousands of women, across 200 years of American slavery, carrying the most intimate secrets of an entire civilization, moving between the world of the enslaved and the world of the enslaver, with their knowledge and their silence as their only protection. They were never in the history books. They were never in the medical journals. They were never in the stories that America told about itself. But they were in every room where American life began, and that means they were in the foundation of everything. Today, in 2024, the United States has one of the worst maternal mortality rates in the developed world, and black women die in childbirth at nearly 3 times the rate of white women. This is not a mystery. This is a direct inheritance of a medical system that was built on the exploitation and dismissal of black women's bodies and black women's knowledge. The enslaved midwife, who was pushed aside by formal white medicine in the 19th century, left a gap that was never properly filled. The knowledge she carried was never properly integrated into American medicine. The distrust she had every reason to feel toward white medical institutions was passed down through generations, and research consistently shows that black women today receive worse care, have their pain dismissed more frequently, and are, less likely to have complications taken seriously. In 2019, the tennis champion Serena Williams nearly died after giving birth because medical staff repeatedly dismissed her concerns about blood clots, despite her being one of the most famous and well-resourced black women on the planet. She survived because she insisted. Many women do not get to insist. The bloodline of medical neglect runs unbroken from the plantation to the present. But the other bloodline, the bloodline of knowledge, of resistance, of the motherwit that Oni Lee Logan described, that runs unbroken too. Today there is a growing movement of black midwives, doulas, and maternal health advocates who are explicitly reclaiming the tradition of the black midwife. Organizations like the National Black Midwives Alliance and the Ancient Song Doula Services in Brooklyn are part of a conscious, deliberate effort to reconnect black maternal care to its roots. These women know where the knowledge came from. They know whose hands held it first. They are choosing to honor those hands by refusing to let the knowledge be buried again. Let me tell you what I want you to take from this story. America was built on a lie. The lie that enslaved black people were less than human, that their knowledge was primitive, that their pain did not count, that their secrets did not matter. Dunchi, black slave midwife, is the living disproof of every single part of that lie. She was more educated than any plantation owner gave her credit for. She was more powerful than any slave code could contain. She held in her hands knowledge that built America's medical tradition, bloodlines that built America's families, and secrets that could have burned America's social order to the ground. She chose silence not because she was weak. She chose silence because she was strategic, because she was protecting herself, her children, her community, because she understood something that her enslavers never did, that knowledge is power, and that the most dangerous kind of power is the kind that nobody knows you have. She was not in the history books. She was not on the monuments. She was not in the medical journals, but she was in every room where American life began. She was in every family tree that America spent 200 years trying to straighten and sanitize and simplify. She was the first keeper of the American truth, and the truth she kept is finally coming out. If this truth hit you the way it hit me when I first found it, share this. Send it to somebody who needs to know this history. Because they don't teach this in school. They never will. Subscribe to Dark Truth for more. Hidden history that America buried, but never destroyed. Drop a comment below. Did you know about the black slave midwives? What part of this story hit you the hardest? And if you want to go deeper, hit that notification bell. Because next time, we're going even further inside the secrets of the plantation. This is Dark Truth. Stay with us.